It's time now for the latest business news. And the first phase of the US-China trade agreement is set to be signed later. Our business editor, Stephen Carroll, is here with the details. Stephen.
Thomas, the Chinese Vice Premier Liu He is in Washington. He's going to be signing this 86-page document with President Trump later this Wednesday. It is a limited agreement which only tackles some of the underlying issues in the now 18-month-old trade war between those two countries. We don't have all the details of that agreement yet. Let's take a look at what's been reported so far. We're expecting the deal to include a commitment from China to buy more than $200 billion worth of US goods, to increase purchases, I should say, by $200 billion. The US is expected to cut tariffs on somewhere between $110 and $120 billion worth of Chinese imports to 7.5%. But tariffs will remain on some $360 billion worth of other goods, despite this agreement. Beijing will commit, though, to stop companies forcing the transfer of American technology to them under this agreement. Many of the other more complex issues will have to wait for a phase 2 of this agreement.
We're very focused on implementing phase 1. We'll start phase 2, but we're very focused. This is an enormous achievement for the president and the economic team. This is the first time we'll have a fully binding agreement with China with structural changes, technology protection, and an additional $200 billion of purchases. So we're very focused on that implementation.
Well, for more on this, let's go to Beijing and speak to our correspondent there, Charles Pellegrin. Charles, most of these tariffs will remain in place under this agreement. Is it good news then for China?
Well, if you just look at the tariffs, it doesn't look great for China, especially with still $360 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese goods entering the United States, which represents 2/3 of all Chinese imports to the U.S. And that's a huge amount of leverage that the U.S. has over China as it tries to keep extracting concessions from the Beijing side in the rest of these negotiations. However, if you look at the other concessions that have been extracted in this phase 1 deal, something, for instance, like the guaranteed better protections on intellectual property, that was something that China was working on independently of the American demands, simply because the Chinese economy has been changing over the years and has become an innovative economy that has been producing more and more technological patents, and they need better intellectual property protection for themselves. So really what's happened here with this phase 1 deal is that China has bought itself some time. The economic planners won't have to contend with threats of new tariffs being applied as they're dealing with a slowing economy, and they'll also be working on trying to reduce the Chinese dependence on the U.S. economy, which would diminish the impact of tariffs.
Charles, a lot of the tricky issues aren't really resolved in this deal. I'm thinking about things like Chinese state subsidies for companies, the controversy around Huawei. Should we expect to see progress on those issues in the future?
Those phase 2 issues are definitely much trickier, much more difficult to resolve, mostly because they get at something that is the industrial subsidies program, which represents basically China's economic model, which gives a huge role to the state in the economy. It is a communist economy, after all, and so this will be much more complicated, and this is not likely to change, especially as those industrial subsidy programs are used to fuel China's development, especially China's technological development. Chinese technological development is worrying the Washington side because they want to make sure that they continue to be the world leader in that particular area. So really it gets to some sort of strategic rivalry between two great powers here. And this also explains the American campaign against Huawei, at least according to Beijing. The Beijing side, this explains why the United States is lobbying governments around the world not to give contracts to Huawei to set up 5G networks, or the sanctions against Huawei. Huawei represents this Chinese economic model that the United States wants to change.
OK, Charles Pellegrin in Beijing, thank you very much for that. Well, now, both the Chinese and American economies have been affected over the past 18 months. It's even cast a cloud over global growth as well. Trade between the two countries fell sharply during the past year, with many American companies left feeling the pain. Cami Nedelec reports.
As the US-China trade war reaches a ceasefire, many Americans will be breathing a sigh of relief, none more so than soybean farmers. After China whacked tariffs on soybeans in response to US tariffs on Chinese goods, soybean exports fell from $12 billion in 2017 to just over $3 billion in 2018.
Resolving this trade war is definitely going to be a great step in the right direction. We knew as soon as the trade war escalated and the price of soybeans dropped so bad that we were in trouble.
The rest of the farming sector is in a similar state, despite an emergency package of $28 billion of government aid. Importers are also facing fallout as Chinese exporters failed to cut prices. Buyers had to absorb the cost or face passing it on to their consumers. This bike company used to depend on factories in China to make their bicycles. To escape the tariffs, it decided to relocate production to Taiwan. But it was a bumpy ride.
So when you're looking at a bike, there's so many different components. All of these small parts are produced by specialty manufacturers that specialize in a particular component or particular set of components. So it's not as simple as just moving over and going to a one-stop shop. That doesn't exist.
Bilateral trade declined by over $100 billion since the start of the dispute. And though Trump has held off from imposing a new round of tariffs, the ones currently in place look set to remain. So the consequences of the trade war could drag on long after the deal is signed.
Now, a lot of the drama around the US-China trade war played out on the financial markets. They took a tumble at every escalation and breathed sighs of relief when it looked like the tensions were being calmed. But now, today on the markets, we are seeing falls across Asia. Of course, the markets had known about this deal for a while, so there's no great surprise for them to react to. But investors are digesting those comments from Stephen Mnuchin. We heard earlier that the tariffs will remain in place for now, and that's feeding into the negative sentiment in Asia today. Thomas.
OK, Stephen Carroll with the latest business news.